So today I'll start over. We're going to talk about ethical principles and data science in the context of repurposing data, primarily local, administrative, and opportunity data. And these ideas and concepts became important to us as we began to work with local communities as we conducted our research. And we define community quite broadly. It is very much local communities, Arlington, Virginia, or Marshalltown, Iowa. But it's also the Army. It's sometimes large into Fortune 500 company, or it's the official statistics community as well, where we work with specific agencies, the Census Bureau or the National Center for Science and Engineering Statistics. But what I want to focus on is that just as we're ethical in our daily lives, we want to be ethical in our research, especially with working with data scientists from other disciplines, some of who don't really think about ethics when they're doing their work. It's not that they're unethical, they just don't think about that as part of their mandate. And statisticians have always been at the center of this, whether it's in their field work or in the lab and now in data science. It's part of our culture, but our obligation is to bring this ethical umbrella when working with our colleagues across disciplines. So our focus is not just on artificial intelligence and algorithms, but those are important. Those biases are important. It's rather we want to ensure that throughout the entire life cycle of our work, whether it's formulating our hypotheses or the data sources that we select or the statistical methods that we choose, that we're not introducing bias in an unintentional way. So today we have advances in information technology, computation, statistics, and it's now possible to access, integrate, and analyze these massive amounts of data over time and space. And this massive data repurposing, it's a common practice now. We just have all the tools to do it. But what we're really focused on in our lab is that we first repurpose all possible data sources before we even identify new data collection. And we've yet to have to actually do new data collection because there is such a wealth of data, as I will demonstrate out there. And we call this the democratization of data or access to the data. And we find that if we can group our data into these 4 bins, it helps us both identify data sources, but also understand how these data are born, which is a really important part of data discovery that I'm going to talk about. So this is one of the frameworks that we use. But let me step back for a minute and tell you a little bit about who we are. We are a data science research group that's part of the Biocomplexity Institute at the University of Virginia. And scientists in our institute conduct research that spans from theoretical bench biology at the molecular level, and it scales to populations and societies. By the name of our division, the Social and Analytics Division, Decision Analytics Division, we're obviously on the populations and society side of that mission. And we're actually purposely located in Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from DC, rather than down in Charlottesville with the rest of our institute. And that's in part because of the nature of the work that we're doing. So our work brings together, we use a large variety, always the federal statistical data collects. They're important as your infrastructure. But we also make heavily use of local administrative data. We scrape the web for opportunity data. And then importantly, we've also discovered that procedural data are really important as well, especially when we're doing our work with the Army. So we use a mix of statistical, geospatial, and machine learning methods to do our work. And we are a collection, we like to say an intentional collection of statisticians and social behavioral scientists who have a passion for improving the quality of life for everyone through data. So through the course of doing our work, we realized that we had a data science framework, and we call it a life cycle, and it's somewhat similar to other data science frameworks that you'll see. It starts with a problem identification, and I will have to say that when we work with the community, they are the ones who identify the problems or challenges they want addressed, but then we're the ones who do the literature review and the working hypotheses to develop a research plan to address those questions. But what we think is novel and different about our work is data discovery. And we call data discovery important where we dream about what the ideal data sources might be, but then we set out to find them. You rarely find them, but you do find lots of potential data that could be used. And as I'm going to describe shortly, we undertake a data screening process to identify if the data are useful for the research at hand. And then the data wrangling, that's, traditional. You do the data profiling of those variables you think you're interested in to assess their quality, and then you have to prepare and link and explore the data. And of course, this is oftentimes where you spend 70, 80% of your time doing the work. So you have to love it. You have to love data science for that. And hopefully it will get easier over time as we develop methods and tools to make it easier to work with these large data sets. And of course, the statistical modeling and analysis is also important. It's important to take care in choosing the methods that are used, especially when you are taking into account the ethical dimensions of it, and validated using multiple approaches as well. And then we emphasize communication throughout the project, that you don't just go off to your research lab and do the work, but that you're actually communicating about the project with the community leaders and others involved in the research. And oftentimes we will see things that are puzzling to us in the data, and then we show it to a community leader or somebody that we're working with, and they can explain it and provide the context for it. So it really is a partnership. We can't do this by ourselves. And of course, we have the dissemination through the traditional vehicles that we all use. And finally, ethics. It's a set of guiding principles that we have to ensure this dialogue occurs throughout the life cycle of the project. And of course, that's the purpose of this talk. But the reason it's a sidebar is because it is integrated into all facets of our work. It's not done as an afterthought, or it's not just done, oh, I did my IRB, now I don't have to think about ethics anymore. No, that's just the beginning. So what are our obligations to use these data ethically? I just, over the weekend, happened to watch a movie that was recommended called The Social Dilemma. It's really a docudrama, so it's, quote, a true story. And it's a Netflix doc if you're interested in watching it. And former employees of Google and Facebook and Twitter all left their jobs because they were really concerned about what these companies were doing by making their technologies addictive. It sounds like back in the era of cigarettes. How do you make them more addictive? And so the movie is actually quite compelling and thoughtful in talking about this. They call it a surveillance capitalism, in which they know everything about you more than you probably even know about yourself. But they were optimistic in thinking that we can, in the future, reach some balance between having these technologies, which have definitely improved our life, but not having this addictive part to them or the surveillance component, which may always be there, but to be using this for the public good, not for personal gain or for profit. So it takes time to do this. It takes research. And we're going to see that this has been a dilemma throughout the whole story of ethics, at least going back since the 1950s or 1940s and then moving forward. And so it does take time, often decades, not just weeks or years to do this. So I want to give just two examples, and they do focus actually on algorithms, but I think they set the stage for why having conversations throughout the life cycle is so important. And you may be familiar with this example, but back in 2016, Amazon decided that they were going to do a predictive model to see where they would deliver same-day delivery or deliver it. And they purposely didn't use race in their equations. Yet the data mapped almost perfectly by race. So the blue areas are primarily white neighborhoods, and based on these algorithms, they were going to be targeted for same-day delivery. The white areas are primarily minority areas, and they were not going to be targeted. Amazon, to its credit, when this was pointed out to them, did adjust some of the same-day delivery schedules, but still, it's a cautionary tale that they thought they were doing the right thing by not including race, and perhaps they needed to. Another example is similar. Hospitals use algorithms to assign risk scores to their patients. And in this example, the scores were derived from hospital bills and insurance payouts that track illnesses and hospitalizations and other variables. But what independent health researchers noticed were that Blacks had, or African Americans had, very low risk scores, even though they had poor health. And so they set out to discover why. And what they did was they tweaked the algorithm, and instead of using the insurance bills and payouts, instead they actually predicted the number of chronic illnesses that a patient will experience in a year and assigned a risk score based on that. And by doing this, they were pretty much able to eliminate the racial disparity by a large amount, by 84, their number was 84%. So there was still some social bias in the data and in the algorithm, but they were able to reduce it greatly. So I think both these examples just demonstrate that when algorithms are used, you need both internal peer review, external peer review, and questioning all along the way. Do these make sense? So an analogy that I like to give about repurposing data is the panopticon prison metaphor. Today, we can observe behavior based on repurposing existing data without consent or awareness by those providing the data. When you think about all the publicly available administrative data that are available, and even then how you combine it with survey data or other kinds of data, we can now observe behavior without people knowing it. Well, Panopticon prison is a circular prison. It's a circular building, and the cells are built around a central watchtower. So they only need one guard in the watchtower, and he can observe all the prisoners without being seen. So the question is, of course, who's watching the guard in the watchtower? So in a similar way, it's the researchers who are repurposing data that should be watched to ensure good behavior without restricting access to these data. Our view is that we do go to a lot of effort to restrict access, and we top code or we do things to the data that then make it less reliable. We would advocate that we punish misuse of the data rather than restricting access for everyone. And of course, that would be the topic for another talk at another time. So let's review the history of ethics and how it relates to data science. The Nuremberg Code was created in 1947, and it was to address the notorious World War II experiments that were undertaken primarily in Germany, but in other places as well. And this written document establishes 10 principles, ethical principles for protecting human subjects. My takeaway from these principles is that we actually don't need to reinvent the wheel. Great minds have actually put a lot of thought into what these are. I am just so taken away, though, by how clearly they're written. And at least until we hit the big data world, they actually do very clearly lay out the principles involved in how we conduct research using human subjects. And this is where I say finding that balance in research. If we now, these foreshadowed the Belmont principles, which underlie our research now. If you flash forward to 30 years later, we had a Belmont Commission put together the ethical principles that would govern research in the United States. And it was in response actually to the ethical failures of researchers that had been ongoing for over 40 years. The most famous of these ethical failures is the Tuskegee syphilis study, and that was conducted from 1932 to 1972. And it was to observe the natural progression of untreated syphilis of poor African American men. And where they violated the ethical principles is that none of the men were told they had the disease, and none were treated with penicillin even after the antibiotic was proven to be successful in treating syphilis. So in another example, which is similar, researchers intentionally infected mentally disabled children with hepatitis and observed its natural progression. And that was all with the permission of the local public health department. So there's many examples, there's dozens, and it was because of these ethical failures that the Belmont Commission formed and produced the Belmont Report. And I would say that, by today's standards, those research examples violated all the principles, but I sort of feel like they did even then. It was just that they were allowed to do that research. So the Belmont Commission came up with 3 principles that laid the foundation for our institutional review board process. The first is respect for persons, and that's treating people as autonomous and honoring their wishes. So they can participate in the study. They have a choice of participating in the study or not. The second is beneficence, is weighing the risk, understanding the risk and benefits of first doing no harm and then maximizing the benefits while minimizing the harm. And then the third is justice. Are the risk and benefits of the research distributed fairly? Does everyone have an opportunity to participate and benefit from this research? So these principles led to the common rule now, which governs all U.S. research. And if you have a grant from NIH or from NSF or any of the other government agencies, you are bound to follow these rules. But what I want to note here is that the focus for the Belmont Report and our current IRB is research involving human subjects. So now we're going to flash forward to 2012. And it became obvious to computer scientists, and there were very well-known computer scientists who were on the Menlo Commission and who wrote the Menlo Report. And they were commissioned to introduce the Belmont Principles to information communication and technology, the field, the ICT field, or what we would call computer scientists and maybe engineers. But what the Menlo Report does is that it extends the principles in two important ways. They added a fourth principle, which was respect for law and public interest. And then they expanded the focus to include research with human harming potential. So that it's not just a focus on the research with human subjects. So we say this change is important in the digital age where the use of technologies and repurposing of data can expose people to risks. So we recommend that even though you may only be required to follow the Belmont principles, that in fact as researchers and data scientists and statisticians, that in fact we embrace this broader criteria. So the Menlo Report also at the same time or soon after, in the next year, issued a companion report. And this delved deeper into like how to apply these principles to your research. And they provide case studies and assistive questions. So they give you ideas because as we've discovered in trying to implement ethics throughout our life cycle is asking the right questions is more challenging than it might seem. And they just talk about why is the new environment different. So to me, they were focusing on computer scientists, but really the intent was this data revolution that we're in the midst of and our whole new world of data. And so they talked about, the scale of the data, the speed which results can be produced that affect millions of people, and the tight coupling of our interconnected resources. Just think how much information is just on your cell phone about you. Your contacts, your family members, your insurance bills, all of that. And then the next three are really more like, they're both positives and negatives that the data are just centralized and widely distributed, but opaque. That's not necessarily a good thing. And so that makes the research more challenging because if you need to work collaboratively or reach out to get informed consent, it may be hard because of this new world where these data are decentralized, widely distributed, and opaque. And we often think of our apps, they're so simple to operate, but actually the underlying inner workings of these applications and devices are actually quite complex. So I've given you a little bit of history and how we've arrived at the principles that guide our research. So how does this apply to all the research using all data? Well, what I want to do is I want to go back to our data science framework and focus a bit on data discovery and reflect on that and how we actually find data. So as I described earlier, we always start with our question of interest and we go through the whole process, the whole data science life cycle. But the data discovery is important, and we believe that our research should really start with this process, not just with the data that we usually have at hand or data that we're familiar with. And we gain a lot by learning about these data sources as we're trying to solve our problems or their research questions. So let me put it in the context of a research question that we had that the Census Bureau actually asked us. They said, is it possible can you capture local data? And in this case, it was about housing. Could you replace, replicate, and enhance the American Community Survey data with local data? And we took that challenge on, and we realized this was really a much broader question, that if you could characterize the entire housing stock with both rental and owned characteristics as well as the environmental characteristics, you'd then have a powerful set of data to marry into other kinds of information about social and economic conditions. So we've actually found that these housing and property data provide a really important source that can help you understand the social condition. So we set out to do the data discovery exercise, and this is where it's always great to have young people. This is just one slide, and we identified over 50 data sources, and this doesn't even list the federal data sources, which around housing, that identify about another 30 sources or so. So we undertook a data screening process, or we first inventory them, and then we do a more detailed screening, just ask a series of questions to determine if the data meet our need. I'm going to talk about a second example just to reinforce this point. When we worked with Fairfax County, Virginia, which is it's the largest county in Virginia, in Northern Virginia, they asked us about another problem with using data. They were interested in the topic of teen obesity and physical activity. So we went through the data discovery exercise, and this wasn't all the data sources we found. These were the ones we ended up using in our analysis. And the goal was to identify those data sources that would help us understand the trends and patterns to create a predictive model for them around teen obesity and physical activity. So we did the inventory of data sources, and again, you'll see that sometimes it's called real estate tax assessment data, sometimes it's called property data. And actually, with respect to that, when we're working with one county like Fairfax, their data are almost flawless. They're beautiful data. But if you're working with more than one county, we have actually found it useful to use a data aggregator such as CoreLogic to use the data. But back to our screening, so the kinds of questions we ask is what time frame do the data cover, what geography is available, what variables are relevant for the research, what's required to acquire the data, and importantly, how are the data born, how were they created, and why? Because those two questions actually get at the heart of sometimes whether or not you believe there's biases in the data or not. So we've talked a little bit about the ethical dimensions of repurposing data, the principles of using these data, and I gave you two examples of how we undertake identifying data sources to use in our research. But I want to step back for a minute and just refresh about definitions, because I think it's really important that these be clear in our head as we go forward when we think about understanding the ethical dimensions of our work. So the first is privacy, and that refers to the amount of information that I as an individual are willing to share with you or with researchers. And then the flip side is confidentiality. That's the responsibility of those who bring data together. Are they adequately protecting the privacy expectations to keep individuals' data private? And that's not to say that you maybe you might be able to identify people, but that's not your intent as a researcher to do that, and you're not trying to do that. And of course, security is always important. It applies to the data storage and transport. And of course, that's only noticed if it doesn't work, but it's a really important piece of it. And then the privatization of data is the collection and aggregation and reprocessing of personal data to sell to consumers. So it's like the CoreLogic data that we're willing to pay because it saves us a lot of time, not having to go county by county to collect those data. Although we have done some of that to compare and look at the quality, to assess how good the quality of those data are. So another issue when we're talking about this is informed consent. Where does informed consent live in all of this space of repurposing data? It's especially when we're integrating the data. So I want to point out that we're not doing case management. That would be where law enforcement officers are trying to find somebody, or we're not doing case management like in social work. So we're not trying to identify the individual again. So the question about surveillance versus privacy, it always comes up when we talk about these issues. But as I said, we're interested in understanding, as we like to say, the social determinants of health broadly. Or we're interested in looking at socioeconomic trends. So with that in mind, I think that out of the Evidence-Based Policymaking Commission came a really good statement that anyone that has access to data held by the government, this should occur only in service to the public interest. So it's not that we allow people who have interest in using these data for personal gain, or that companies who use it to make a profit. These data need to be used only in service of the public good. And this is a theme that we will see throughout. So going back a little bit to our IRBs, there are times when waivers of the elements of consent are needed. It spells out the principles that govern the use of the data about human subjects and animals, archival data, all types of data to do that. But there's also information about waiving informed consent. And that is allowed when there's no more than minimal risk to the subjects. And if you gain consent, it has the potential to bias the results or put those human subjects in danger. Or when you're using archival data or administrative data, it would actually be almost impossible to gain consent from these data, which are often publicly available to begin with. So the IRB process does allow us to use these data in a responsible way that adheres to the principles of privacy, confidentiality, and security. So just a few more that we'll review, but you're going to see a theme here that the use of data is allowed for the public good. The Privacy Act actually applies to federal government agencies, but the gist of this is that they do allow data to be used for statistical research. And again, it's not to build the case management system, but actually for social workers, but it's to ensure you're doing statistical analysis and policy-focused analysis with a public good intent. And finally, we do a fair amount of data sharing agreements with local government, and you see the same thing, that it's for the public good. So like this is an example of a data sharing agreement that we have with Fairfax County, and it says that we're allowed to have access to their data if we, it seeks to improve the county and citizens' quality of life and services while accelerating the county's efficiency and resiliency. So we see this theme repeated, and I think it's important that we think about this throughout the life of our project as well. So now we're going to go back a little bit in time and talk about some changes in how responsible science and how that relates to ethics. In fact, ethical research is about conducting responsible science. But in 1992, the National Academies of Science decided that they could only support a very narrow definition of responsible science. Reading the quote, misconduct in science is defined as fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism in proposing, performing, or reporting research. But they purposely kept their definition very narrow, and they excluded questionable research practices that would more broadly might be considered unethical today. And I think they did that just to err on the side of caution. But and this was reinforced in 2000 when a unified federal policy on research misconduct was announced, and that drew largely from this 1990 report to say, and you could see it in the language at the National Science Foundation and the Department of Health and Human Services, including NIH, that the focus on research integrity was very much on this narrow definition of misconduct. But then in 2017, they revisited this issue, and they decided that it was time to broaden in the definition of integrity or research integrity in our research. And they did reaffirm the 1992 recommendations on scientific misconduct, but they concluded that we needed to broaden how we think about research integrity, and that it needed to meet these 6 criteria, these 6 core values of objectivity, honesty, openness, accountability, fairness, and stewardship. Really, those are almost the same words that we heard when we looked at the Belmont Principles, or that we looked at the Nuremberg Code to some extent, but it's extending it now and putting it into a larger context of today's research. And it also stated, and this is where the responsible conduct of research comes in, that it also embraces practicing integrity. And research means planning, proposing, performing, reporting, and reviewing research in accordance with these core values, so that we need to undertake all these steps and be documenting what we're doing as well, and engaging in research in a collegial and collaborative way that also is one that has ensures there's dialogue and constructive criticism, which is really our peer review system to a large extent, but to bring that down into our research projects. So I'm going to summarize a bit here because we've had a lot of different principles, and I'm going to introduce some new ones. On the right-hand side are principles that are outlined by the Bloomberg Data for Good Exchange. And what I like about their principles is that They put the Belmont principles into what I would call everyday language. They talk about, is the research fair? Will it benefit society at large? And is it open and transparent and replicable? And are we able to describe what's in the data? That's the reliability, understanding your data and how it's formed. And recently, well, maybe not so recently, there's also another set of principles called FAIR, and that means, are your data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable? And these are a little bit tougher, I think, in the natural sciences, where this started. This is easier where you can share your data. It's often hard in the social science world to be sharing your data when it's sometimes proprietary, sometimes not. With a lot of the administrative and publicly available data, you can at least describe what you've done. Sometimes putting it together might, raise questions if you made it publicly available as well. So we're still grappling with that. And in fact, in our group, we have a NSF eager grant to look at the reusable part of that. But what I like to say is that the Belmont and Memo principles that you see on the left-hand side guide our research projects. And the data for good exchange and these FAIR principles really guide our research actions or how we implement these principles. And of course, the two are tightly intertwined. But it just provides another context or way of thinking about ethics when we're undertaking our research. So in our lab, or our research group, we have implemented an ethics data checklist for our data science lifestyle, and it aligns with our life cycle, with our framework. So we have a set of questions that we ask at each stage of the research to do this. And we've just started doing this. We implemented it in the summer of 2019 when we had our Data Science for the Public Good Young Scholars Program. And what we discovered is these discussions are not so easy. We also discovered that the IRB process is a necessary condition, but not sufficient for addressing a researcher's ethical responsibility in his or her research. So the checklist, for us at least, is a reminder at each stage of the research to have these conversations, and we do it both informally and formally at specific milestones. So again, this is not the full, it doesn't provide the questions on it, but just having the checklist doesn't mean that this is easy to do. It's a reminder that the dialogue is important along the way. This is just a shorter version. We have questions that come under each of it. But the initial reaction from at least our young scholars was, well, if the data are publicly available, I don't understand why we have to even think about ethics. And of course, that misses the whole point that, is your research question ethical? Are the data sources you're using ethical? Are the statistical methods the right ones to be using? And is your interpretation correct? So knowing the context is key, and I'll just give a really simple example of 2 summers ago. We were doing a study for Fairfax County, and we were identifying the vulnerable regions within the county. And when I saw the results, what they had identified as being the most vulnerable area of the county was actually the wealthiest part of the county. So this was a really good learning moment for them. They assumed that if you were on septic and well water, that you were vulnerable. And I said, well, did you cross-check or validate this with income or with other characteristics of these households? And they hadn't. And so, of course, they went back, redid the results, and found that, in fact, that was not the most vulnerable, but in fact, the least vulnerable. But our biases and our assumptions that come in as we deal with the data, most of them were a lot were from New York or large cities, and so they were just assuming that septic and well water meant you were vulnerable, and obviously it doesn't. So I want to give you another example as well about understanding bias and how to fold it into our project. This summer we just started research about economic mobility in rural places in 3 states, so Virginia, Iowa, and Oregon. And at the end of the talk, I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview about that because we're really excited about this research. But one of the professors at Iowa, he wanted to start the project out by really getting these students to think about what their own biases might be about rural America. So he asked them, what's life like in rural America? What's the best thing about it, the worst thing? What are the most pressing problems? And how can data scientists help rural communities? And they use the Mentimeter, which is this very easy to access kind of tool, and people can provide answers anonymously, and then you can have all sorts of different ways that the data are presented. So in response to the question, what's life like in rural America, some of the words, it's lower economic mobility, they're uneducated, they're agriculture, they're poor. Simple might be good or bad, you don't know. But overall, they're ignorant. Some of these are not, anyway, it was their biases. But the beauty of using this Mentimeter tool is they could immediately see their own biases. So they were able to go into the research, working with the communities with open eyes. And hopefully this was also the lesson learned. But I thought it was a deceivingly simple way of trying to get students and researchers to understand their bias. So in another example, Jennifer is just a bit of background. Jennifer Eberhardt is a Stanford psychologist, and she's an expert in working with police departments and others to understand and reduce implicit bias. So it's just one example, the company Nextdoor, or Nextdoor.com. They saw what they called too many suspicious character postings on its online bulletin boards. And these were based solely on race. So they called Eberhardt in and asked her to consult. And she suggested that they create a checklist so that when people logged in to report suspicious behavior, they would first describe what the activity was before they described the appearance of the person or people. And so she calls this friction. And that means having people evaluate their reasoning before they make biased assumptions. And what Nextdoor.com discovered was that the incidence of racial profiling fell by 75%. So not completely eliminating it, but greatly reducing it. But I tell these stories, both of these, or maybe all three stories, because the solutions were fairly straightforward and simple, but I would say very, very creative, and changed the dynamic about how we think about approaching problems. The other would be, can you imagine that if, say, we had used the Nextdoor.com data before we saw that change and you were looking at the quality of life in certain neighborhoods, we might be perpetuating these biases as well by the simple act of using the data before the quote had been corrected. So I think it's subtle, but work and thinking about it it's hard, and it's the whole process. The algorithms are important, but it's the whole process of deciding how we're approaching the research project as well. So we do recommend that research projects implement ethical principles into their research. We all do that implicitly maybe, but that we make it an active and continuous part of the project, and that it also be part of the documentation transparency going forward. And sometimes you do get stuck. And so I think just like Nextdoor.com had the wherewithal to seek expert help, but we can do that by reaching out to others in other research centers or people that we know at our universities that work in this area. And what we found is that the professional associations, so American Statistical Association, the American Physical Society, these all have very good ethical guidelines, and they're a good starting point. They won't give you all the answers and questions, but they help you think about ethics in your research. And then finally, I like this idea of introducing friction by, again, interrogating ourselves and being aware when we're beginning to make stereotypic associations with the word. So where does that leave us? We are changing the focus of privacy discussion, and we're doing that. I'm sort of going back to our privacy and why this is so important. And we want to move that needle from masking and suppression to maintain of the data, to maintain confidentiality, to trust policy and governance. We're in a world now where it's not even possible to do that with all the possible data sources that we have. But even where you could, we're advocating that that not be done. But it highlights this role of ethics in all stages of the life cycle, and that we advocate this principles-based approach to our research. We think that this is really important there's not always specific rules that will guide our decision. And so by taking a principles-based approach, we can make decisions for even where rules don't yet exist. And so we think this in itself is a revolution in thinking about ethics and privacy as well. So I wanted to bend your ear a little bit. So that's the end of my talk, and I thank you. And I'm really interested to learn about how you all think about ethics. But if you had a few more minutes, I wanted to just tell you about some recent research that we're just wrapping up a pilot on. And so I thought maybe I could spur some of you to look at our data if that works for people. So get a nod or yes or no, or you wanted to, okay. I'm seeing some nods anyway. That's good. All right. So let's, I'll just go on to my next slide then and tell you, throughout the life of our research lab started in 2013, and we thought when we stepped out our front door in Arlington, Virginia, that we were going to be working with megacities. That was the rage in 2013. Everybody, Barcelona, New York, San Francisco. But what we discovered was that when we met with the fire chief, police chief, CIO, and all the others across Arlington, that it was these smaller counties and cities that were hungry for for data science being brought to them. And that wasn't going to happen because they didn't have the resources to do it. So slowly as we began to work, and these were primarily urban counties and cities that we were working with, but being at that point, we were at Virginia Tech, we were at a land-grant university, and we were beginning to try to understand the cooperative extension service that when we would apply for grants and things, we wanted to figure out how to scale our bringing data science to these smaller cities and counties and rural areas and rural towns. We realized that we had a ready-made mechanism through the cooperative extension, which is an arm of land-grant universities. And the program was created in 1916 in order to translate research from land-grant universities to communities. And so we're like, they're there. They need data science as well to be able to answer these questions that they work on in local communities as well. And they are already in place in all 3,000 counties across the United States, both urban and rural. So we had this vision for a long time, and we were applying for grants. And finally, in the last year, we applied for a USDA program to bring our data science program for young scholars to develop it more widely. And so we formed a 3-state coordination network with Iowa, Oregon, and Virginia to infuse data science into agricultural research and to disseminate this through the cooperative extension. So they would become the liaison between our research teams and the communities. And then about the same time, the Gates Foundation became very interested in economic mobility and the use of the cooperative extension network to develop and disseminate community-driven data science researches to advancing economic mobility. So we were able to bring these two projects together in a way that helped us to advance our vision for this. And over the time of our lab, we have developed this process called community learning through data-driven discovery. And through this process, what it is it's a continuous learning cycle, and we borrow the language from the health learning that occurs. And so it's an iterative process that you engage with the community, you partner with them to find data sources, you conduct data science or data analysis, and then the cycle begins, and you can do that. So the outer circle is really the engagement with the community, the inner circle is really our data science process, and that's being informed by our rigorous data science framework that guides our work. And so actually that's what I've just described here, and it would have been in more detail, but you'll all have a copy of the slides. So fast forward to doing this, we're wrapping up our economic mobility. We still managed to conduct our data science for the Public Good Young Scholars Program and conduct economic mobility projects this summer. We did it all virtually, so that was another challenge in and of itself. The one benefit to doing that is that we had much more interactions with our communities because it was actually easier for them to join by Zoom than it was to arrange meetings and do that kind of thing. So the end result is that we've created an economic mobility data infrastructure, and right now it's just for Virginia, Iowa, and Oregon. And we're using a community capitals framework to create these composite indicators on the underlying data that communities now can use, and they can use that working with their cooperative extension to help identify both their strengths and then building on their strengths, how do they learn to use these data to inform their decision makings. And so we would encourage you to explore the data at our website. You can either go to the link that's on the slides, or if you just Google data science for the public good, economic mobility, data infrastructure, it's a lot of words, but I think basically it will pop up, and we would love your feedback on this as well. This just actually deployed last week, and so you can tell that we're really excited about it and look forward to having discussions with you. We also have a vision now to scale this nationally, and so of course more input by nationally, I mean for each of the 50 states. And one of the hallmarks of our research right now, the dashboard's focused on county and state data, but our research has generally been at the sub-county level, so that will also be another aspect that we would start to look at neighborhoods within a county, not just the county level data. So with that, I welcome your questions about ethics or economic mobility or anything that you're interested in. And when you do, I'd like to, if you'd share with you a little bit about how you're incorporating ethics into your work as well.
Great. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I will start by first opening the floor for any questions or ideas. Well, I guess I would. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is stewardship in the sense of ethics?
So stewardship to me is that has to do with the privacy and confidentiality and storage and maintaining of your data in a way that protects the confidentiality of the users. I think it also has to do with the documentation and vetting and being clear about what your processes and thought processes were and challenges that you faced.
And I had a question about how to address hidden biases.
Well, it's hard, and that's why I showed those examples. It takes a lot of creativity and discussion and dialogue and people thinking about it. And we actually think that if we can do this through the whole life cycle of a project, you might not have the answers at the beginning, but you're more aware of it and you're beginning to think about it. It's hard, and that's what, those examples made it almost look simple, but it's not so simple.
Thank you.
But the more we do it, hopefully we get better at it.
That was an excellent talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, good. I'm glad you liked it. So.
Other questions?
I have a question about how to reconcile the Bayesian concept if people wanted to use an informative prior and avoid being labeled as having bias, because you can never guarantee that your prior is going to have a mean right at the center of your posterior. That's what priors are. That's before you have the data. But right. Do you have to use an uninformative prior to avoid having bias?
No, I don't think so. I think you just have to question your priors and question, do they make sense and are they fair? I mean, we do a lot of Bayesian analysis in our research group, and that actually hasn't come up as a question, so that's really interesting. But I would say no. I mean, yes, you can use Bayesian analysis, and you just have to. Again, that's part of the discussion about what are those priors and do they make sense.
Thank you.
So I will ask the question. I think it's really interesting, and in a way, I somewhat trust researchers more than I trust outside people or companies. Is there any way to make that type of requirement a policy or something that everyone has to go through, even outside company, and then how do we enforce something like that?
I mean, you raise a really good question. The first time I gave a very early version of this talk, there was a woman in the audience who works for industry, and her question was, how do we even train our workers to think ethically? I mean, for her, this was really important. And I do think that we always emphasize that a lot of this are for researchers, and access to these data are for researchers doing public good research. that you would not give access to a Google or a Facebook to the administrative data that are confidential. You're allowed to have it with the intent of using it for research for the public good, not research for profit. So I think that's why you have the Commission on Evidence-Based Policy has come out with their report about how to do this. There's been a lot of talk about creating another entity that would be like when you say, well, punish misuse, allow people to allow researchers to have access to these data, but then punish misuse. And so there's talk about how you might create an institute or, a quasi-governmental entity that might sit between statistical agencies and universities or statistical agencies and researchers to do that. But again, we're just right at the beginning of learning how to do this, and it's hard. Probably not a super satisfactory answer, right? So.
Well, life is hard, but yes, it's it's as good as you have right now, right? In some way. Also, you could think about stuff that is not private, but some places, some companies collect private information, and then they use this thing that we think that is not private to inform themselves. I don't know how that will work.
I think just like the movie The Social Dilemma talks about, we can do that. We can get there. But look at how long, 1947, the Nuremberg Code comes out. 30 years later, the U.S. finally does the Belmont Principles. And another 20 years later, or 30 years later again, then we come out with the Menlo Principle. So it seems like it takes a long time for these things to happen. As fast-paced as our world is, it seems to be taking the traditional research route of taking up much longer. And I think because it's so many different disciplines involved and so many different perspectives. And I think as a researcher coming from a university, it's like, of course we would do that. Of course we're not going to misuse the data. But things do happen. But I think the industry question is a really good one too, that we need to address.
Other questions?